behalf of the Management Committee of the Irish Jewish Museum, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening, and an especially warm welcome to Dr. Aidan Beatty, who has just flown in from the United States to be with us here tonight on the occasion of the launch of his latest book, Irish Questions and Jewish Questions, Crossovers in Culture. And Dr. Don O'Brien, who's his co-editor, excuse me, will be reading from the book this evening, and I think both of you will be able to take questions afterwards. But first of all, I'd like to introduce to the podium Dr. Mary McAuliffe, who is assistant professor at the University College Dublin and an expert in Irish history. And Dr. McAuliffe will give an introduction to our speakers this evening. Thank you very much. May I please, before you do start, point out the emergency exits. We have an emergency exit over here, a new one, straight out. I hope we don't have to use it. And another one downstairs. And also, please, if I could remind you to turn off your phones, that would be great. Thank you so much indeed, and I hope you have an enjoyable evening.
Good evening, everyone, and it's a great honour to be here, and I was greatly honoured when Dan and Aidan asked me to launch this collection of essays. For a number of reasons, but one of the most pertinent is I used to live on Kingsland Parade for many years when I was a student, and I passed by the Irish Jewish Museum every day and visited here many times. But particularly this book, Irish Questions and Jewish Questions, Crossover in Culture, kept me enthralled over the days that I was reading it in preparation for this. One thing of many that struck me was how welcome these interventions are from a more pluralistic historical perspective. Collections like this are very necessary, and I think in many ways, sometimes we're told in universities you need the monograph, you need to get your book out. But collections like this that bring together essays from different scholars who are using different methodologies to look at a particular subject or a series of subjects that are interrelated are very welcome in that they give us different perspectives and different viewpoints. And as Aidan and Dan write in their introduction, Irish history writing has often suffered from an inward-looking perspective. I would agree with that. And Irish historians have reassured themselves that nothing that happened on the European continent, or indeed further afield, need disturb the tranquility of their scholarly lives. I would argue further that Irish historians reassure themselves that nothing outside of the mainstream, male, middle-class centred narratives of, in particular, this revolutionary period or the late 19th and into the 20th century, disturb the tranquility of their scholarly lives, research and publications. That is not to say that these histories were in error, these historians were in error. They weren't. Many of them wrote books that we can still consider, and deservedly so, classics, that still, they are still the go-to publications for thoroughly researched, rigorous, scholarly, mainstream history. But there were always absences and lacunae in these books. Areas of research that held little interest, areas that perhaps complicated and disturbed the narrative a little too much if included. In recent years, however, there has been a turn towards looking at these neglected corners of Irish history and of broader history where Irishness interacted and existed, and of seeing Ireland not as an insular subject, but as a space and place interacting with, influenced by, and influencing a much wider world. Perhaps once the revisionist wars of the 1980s abated, there was a space to begin to look away from our own issues and troubles and see a multiplicity of narratives, a variety of histories, all of which interacted and intersected with what was understood as the socio-cultural and political received narratives of the 19th and early 20th century. Perhaps it's more correct to speak of histories rather than history. Of course, for my own research, it is the multiplicity of Irish women's histories, voices and contributions, nationally and internationally, that I look at. And the development of the history of suffrage on this island cannot be understood as a singular insular narrative, as well as the diverse religious and class Irish suffrage women. It can only be understood in the context of British and US and international suffrage, and those intersections are there. As it is with queer histories, with class histories, with racial histories. And the fact that we're beginning to look now at those broader histories is very, very welcome. So I would say this is a very welcome study, a very important study in this growing area of Irish Jewish studies. Indeed, the collection will serve, I would say, to expand, I would more than say, I would say it will, to expand this small area of studies. While there have been previous studies of Jewish histories in Ireland, this collection serves to critique those and expand using innovative and really interesting approaches to history thinking and writing that are necessary to look at. In many ways you can't use mainstream historical methodologies to look at those who were outside of the mainstream narrative, to look at minority populations, excluded populations. You do have to come up with innovative techniques and particularly borrow from other disciplines, which is very important and which happens in this collection. I must admit to those interests here, as an undergrad taking a medieval module in Trinity, I did my research essay on the expulsion of the Jews from England and Ireland in 1290. And it was one of my best essays, actually. And have since then retained an interest in the histories of Jewish communities in Ireland. And the fact that I lived on Kingsland Parade also helped to keep that interest going. I was also being long fascinated with the dig of the Ark of the Covenant, for the Ark of the Covenant in Tara in 1902, especially because of Maud Gonne and Ellie Young's response to it. And apparently they did go down and light a fire to cleanse the area, the disturbing of the Celtic mythology beneath the soil there. So I found Abby Bender's chapter on the British Israelites who undertook this dig shows how Irish identity and Jewishness have had a long and a highly complicated history, as Aidan and Dan have shown. Particularly the emergence of Parnell, which was new to me, I hadn't realised this, as the Moses figure of the poetic nationalist imagining is fascinating, as was the anti-Semitism found in other nationalist writings, Arthur Griffith being a case in point. This was a fascinating chapter to begin the whole collection with, and the quality of research, analysis and writing continued throughout. I actually read it in 2 sittings, so that's a good sign of an edited collection. I found the chapter in Richard Lawler Shield, written by Sandra L. Gilman, fascinating, demonstrating that the anti-Semitism of later nationalists and Republicans, and some of them are actually some of my women that I study, which I actually find I'm a bit uncomfortable with their anti-Semitism when I come across it. Kathleen Lynn and Helena Maloney and a few others are guilty of anti-Semitic remarks, as is, and I always have to say I am from Kerry, as is the Kerry man Thomas Ashe. It was extraordinary to me to read his speech when he was released from jail at the first commemoration of Roger Casement in 1917, and you're reading through and he's making all the arguments for Irish republicanism, and then there's a whole paragraph that's virulently anti-Semitic. And I hadn't read that whole speech until recently, and I found that extraordinary. And this book has explained a lot of that for me. So to see that anti-Semitism that a lot of those revolutionaries expressed was actually not an end point, a natural end point of a singular progressive narrative from what Shield had termed Hebrewophobia. His sophisticated thinking in the middle of the 19th century on prejudice allowed him to see that prejudice against Irish Catholics and Jews stemmed from the same root and demanded the same cure, political will and a call to justice. So I found that really fascinating. I also found, which I haven't written here, but one of the things that has stuck with me since reading that is the whole intersection of Jewishness and the land wars and the land league, and that whole idea of the peddler and the wandering Jew and the Gombeen man. That these things were being written of in Irish history, and yet we ignore them. They aren't written into the narrative. So I think this book is very, very important in many ways about expanding not just revolutionary histories, but also 19th century land wars and our concepts of belonging, inclusion, exclusion. So I don't want to keep you too long because we have our 2 editors to talk, but I will say that every chapter in this collection brings new information, new research, new critiques and new histories to the reader. And it is a good marker of a collection that this is not my area of expertise, but it made me start thinking of ways that I can bring, with reading some of the methodologies used here, to bear on my own research, and that's a good thing in a collection. Divided into sections, representations, realities, migrations and the promised land, the collection contains essays that will illuminate and enlighten you. I found Natalie Wynn's survey of the methodology of Irish Jewish history writing fascinating. Her critique of Cormac O'Grada's Jewish Ireland in the Age of Joyce and Dermot Keogh's Jews in the 20th Century, among others, demonstrates the limitations. And it was something that made me start thinking a bit more about how we look at the women. At looking at non-mainstream groups from the outside and taking that sort of eagle-eye view, that hovering view of history, rather than getting into the nuances and complications of those societies that you're writing about, or those people you're writing about, which of course meant that they missed the nuances of intra-community relationships, while they saw the nuances of the community relationships between mainstream Irish society and the Jewish community. Those intra-community relationships in the Jewish community were missing, and of course that missing informed the way they read sources and led to what Wynne suggests were errors in judgment in reading those sources. I also found Rubin's chapter on the short-lived Judeo-Irish Home Rule Association very, very interesting, and shows the tensions and complications of religious, ethnical and political boundaries. I could go on. I think for me the most challenging chapters were the one from literary history perspective, because it's not my area, but also it made me think of the uses of literary history to the historian, and how, for example, writing women's history, because women don't appear in the mainstream narratives, a lot of the time we have to read their own writings in order to understand their positioning and their concepts of themselves. And particularly the women of the revolutionary period, many of whom wrote unpublished novels. If you read them, you can probably see why they're mostly unpublished. But they are fascinating studies. For example, Rosamund Jacob wrote a novel that's unpublished in which she talks about the position of the single woman in an Irish society post setting up the Free State that privileged the position of wife and mother within marriage. And so what is the spinster? How is the spinster operating in this society? So the use of literature in order to understand, literature from within and literature from outside, gives us another, I suppose, viewpoint, another way of looking at those communities and those histories. And as Dan and Aidan say, Irish Jewish studies is not just the study of actual Jews who happen to live in Ireland, and whose history is often treated as a kind of separate existence in Ireland. I think this book now will stop that. But also the history of the perception of Jews by some of the most important figures and institutions in mainstream Irish life. And I found it extraordinary. A number of the writers talked about the fact that anti-Semitism existed without the actual reality of Jewish people near those people who are being anti-Semitic. I mean, the Jewish community was never very big in Ireland, and yet anti-Semitism was quite acceptable and quite prevalent. So the Irish and the Jews are two of the classic outliers of Europe, with the Irish nationalism and Zionism, as Dan and Aidan say, developing remarkably similar theories of how to end that other status. Using multidisciplinary approaches, this collection is a solitary lesson in innovative global borrowing, especially from literary scholars. And it is challenging for those of us who find that we need to stretch what we see as historical source material. But I think it's worth pursuing that. I want to congratulate the editors, the contributors and the publishers in producing a timely, scholarly, fascinating and highly readable, all of them are very good writers, collection that will have what us academics now have to call impact. But this impact is very welcome and very necessary. Thank you very much.